Hello and welcome to another Chess Tips video. So once again, I'm talking about how to become good at chess. So many ways to do that. I would recommend if you're a beginner, work on tactics, study tactics problems, read books, watch videos on tactics, do lots and lots of puzzles until you become more proficient in tactics. Also play regularly. But another good way to improve is to go over your games and try and figure out what you did wrong and then use a computer to see what you missed. You can also look at the games of the best players in the world and throughout history. Now, the newer chess masters that use computers, and sometimes that makes it harder to follow what they're doing because it can be their games can be much more complicated, especially when they are using computer ideas sometimes. So a good way to start, especially if you're a beginner, or any player really, can become good at chess by going over the games of the best players. So today we have Jose Raul Capablanca, the third world chess champion. He was the world chess champion back in the 1920s, and he is playing the second world chess champion who has the black pieces, Emanuel Lasker, who was the world chess champion for 27 years, I believe. Capablanca finally defeated Lasker in, I think, 1921 maybe, or around there. You can check by looking it up online. But let's take a look at this game. It looks like Capablanca played with 90.8% accuracy versus 84.1% accuracy by his opponent. But Capablanca had one brilliant move and two great moves, whereas Lasker didn't have any. Inaccuracies: 3 by Capablanca, 6 by Lasker, but 3 mistakes by Capablanca and only 1 by Lasker. But Lasker did have 1 blunder. All right, here we go. Let me put on the computer analysis, another way to become good at chess. Like I said, go over your games and then you can run your game through a computer and it'll kind of point out what you did wrong. But I would not recommend relying on the computer completely, because you can really become good at chess by going over your own games and trying to figure out in your head where you went wrong, and visualizing and calculating in your head before you check everything with the computer. So Capablanca starts out with d4. Now, I mentioned ways to become good at chess. Well, learn general opening principles. So here, d4 develops a central pawn. You move it up 2 squares. That way it doesn't block in your bishops. Because if you moved it here to d3, that could potentially block your light squared bishop. So in general, moving 2 squares is good, especially if you move to d3 and then later you have to push up to d4 anyway. You might as well do it all in one move. And now this also controls the e5 square, an important central square. Capablanca responds with knight to f6. So another good opening principle is to develop your pieces, develop the knights before the bishops because they're slower and take longer to move across the board. And also, your knights are almost always well placed on knight to f6 or knight to c6, or knight to c3 or f3 for white. And this gives you time to wait and see where it will be best to place your bishops later in the game. Now, c4 is played because e4 cannot be played because the knight is guarding this strong e4 square in the center. So c4 is played, the next best thing. If you can't place 2 pawns in the center, then 1 in the center and 1 on the flank is almost the next best thing, I guess. So c6 is played here, which now we have an Indian game, a Slav Indian defense here. So why is this played? Well, it does control a central square. Maybe gets ready for the d pawn to push forward. And then if the flank pawn captures your more valuable central pawn here, then this pawn can recapture and you end up with another central pawn. And it's usually good to keep your pawns in the center, and not get rid of them. Especially, you don't want to trade a flank pawn for your more valuable central pawn. So anyway, Capablanca jumps in here behind this c pawn, helps control these light squares in the center, and the game continues with a fight in the center. So one thing you have to watch out for if you want to become good at chess is don't let your opponent just take full control of the center by putting all his pawns in the center and all his pieces. You have to fight back for the center. If this d5 move had not been played, then white could possibly play e4 because now the knight's here to back that up. So this move kind of stops that. All right, so we have a capture of a more valuable central pawn with a less valuable flank pawn, but then a recapture. And so things are pretty equal in the center here. The knights are somewhat equal. How does Lasker respond after Capablanca just develops another knight here? Well, he continues and develops his knight. So now we have a really equal position. Capablanca develops this bishop to f4. And what this does, it allows the bishop to get outside of the pawn chain if this e-pawn pushes up to e3 to guard the d4 pawn. So that's something to keep an eye on. If you want to become good at chess, try not to block your bishops in behind the pawns and create a bad bishop. So the game continues. This is exactly what Lasker has done here. Now Lasker has pushed forward with e6, blocking in his own bishop here. So now he has this bad bishop that's really bad because it's blocked in by his central pawns. Whereas this bad bishop, and if you don't know what a bad bishop is, that's a bishop that is on the same colored squares as your central pawns. But this bad bishop of Capablanca's will be outside the pawn chain once this pawn moves to e3. And in fact, that's what he does. He brings the pawn up to e3, guarding his central pawn and allowing the other bishop to develop now. So we have bishop to e7, getting ready to castle. And if you want to become good at chess, look what the best players do here. They try to castle fairly quickly. So Capablanca now places his bishop to d3 where it eyes the king side. And so Lasker's not afraid of that at the moment. He just castles over there. And we see that if you castle, you can only be attacked from head on or one side. But now that this king is in the middle, it can be attacked from left, right, or the center. So that's 3 attacking angles versus 2 once you castle. So Capablanca, of course, castles as well. And now we have the knight moving here to h5. Why is this the best move? Now there's a piece of advice that a knight on the rim is dim. And generally, you don't want to place your knights on the edge of the board like this. But the knight has a plan. It's targeting this bishop here and trying to get rid of Capablanca's bishop pair. Because once, if they trade off and you get rid of the dark squared bishop and Lasker keeps his dark squared bishop, then his dark squared bishop will be able to fight on all these dark squares, and Capablanca will not have a dark squared bishop to counter Lasker's dark squared bishop. So that is the plan behind that. And Capablanca, he plays the best move here. Why is this best? Well, he's probably thinking, if I'm going to lose this bishop, I might as well get something in return. He could have retreated to g3, and then if the knight captured the bishop, he could have captured with the pawn towards the center, opening the h-file. But there's not a rook there at the moment, and it might take a while to get any use out of that half-open h-file. So he moves the bishop to e5, and here, if this knight captures, well then, he has two different things he could do. He could jump his knight up there, but it could be chased away, or he could lodge a pawn in there, gaining space and kind of restricting these pawns on black side of the board a little bit. So let's see what happens. All of that is ignored in favor of this f5 move. So interesting. And the computer says this is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to immediately attack the bishop and send it running back. So now we have the rook grabbing a half-open file. Now this is a way to become good at chess that will kind of differentiate a better player from a less good player. If you can get your rooks to a square where they're more effective than your opponent. A lot of beginners especially kind of neglect their rooks, kind of just let the rook sit over here in the corner. And it's better to get the rooks either onto open files where there are no pawns, or a half open file if there's only one pawn there. And if you don't have either of those options, you could put a pawn behind pawns, put a rook behind a pawn of yours that you plan to push forward. All right, so the knight repositions back here where it can, it's not really doing much anymore over here, but now it repositions back to f6, the best move, and from there it could jump in here to e4 perhaps. So how does the game continue? Capablanca does not want that knight jumping down onto e4, and so he gets rid of his bad bishop in exchange for a knight. And now we have an interesting part of chess strategy, something you should definitely practice and learn. We have a battle between a bishop pair and the opponent who does not have the bishop pair. If somebody has bishops on the board, they want to open the board up by exchanging the pawns in the center, because that gives the bishops more freedom to move and they'll be stronger. Whereas if the center of the board is closed up and the bishops are restricted, well then knights can become stronger by being able to jump over these pawn barriers. So what happens next? Now we have this interesting move, which computer says this is best, and I don't know. It's kind of hard to see why this might be the best move. What is the knight doing here? Well, it's allowing this pawn to push forward, and perhaps that's why this is the best move, because now this f-pawn can push forward, kind of slow down his opponent's f-pawns and help fight for the center here, especially this e5 square, which it looks like Lasker is trying to push this pawn to e5. So let's see what happens. First, we have king to h8 being played, which computer says that's excellent, but it might have been better to develop the undeveloped bishop here, maybe allow the rook to jump over here to c8 and fight for the open c-file. All right, if you want to become good at chess, you have to figure out where best to place your pieces. And if your pieces don't have very many good squares, you might have to try and create better squares for them to go to. And this might be difficult, especially if you're starting out and you're still a somewhat beginner in chess. But you also want to see what your opponent's doing. So after each move, ask, what is my opponent doing with that move? What did this move do here? Well, it helps lock down this e5 square. That way, we don't have pawn pushing to e5. If we capture, then it would undouble black's pawns. And maybe this is why it was good to move the knight here, because now if this pawn pushes forward, the bishop can capture, knocking out the light squared bishop. So that is a strategy as well to help you become good at chess. If you do not have the bishop pair and your opponent does, it's usually a good idea to knock out their bishop pair as well. Don't let them keep the bishop pair and then eventually open the board up and just blow you off the board. All right, so the rook lines up on the king on the half open file, a good strategy. That's ignored for the moment. Maybe preparing to bring the rook over here to fight for that file. Bishop develops. Rook, instead of trading off over here, lines up on the opponent's king. So that's ignored for the moment. And why was this move played? Well, perhaps if this rook has to move, it prevents a future possible fork of the king and maybe this bishop. At the moment, this knight, it can't really jump forward. Even before the bishop moved there, I guess it could have captured with the rook. All right, moving on. Let's keep this moving along. We have this move, a3. Now, generally, these pawn moves on the side of the board aren't so great unless you have a reason for doing them. I shouldn't say they're not great. If you have a purpose behind your move on the edge of the board, then it's okay. You could push forward and gain space, but here it keeps the knight from being able to jump forward and harass your bishop. So the rook moves forward here, helping protect this pawn in front of the king, and it leaves the possibility of doubling rooks up against the Capablanca's king here in the future. So now rook to g3 is played, the best move in the position, forcing forcing Lasker to figure out what he wants to do. Ignore it, exchange. Let's find out. He captures, doubling the pawns up. So, what did this do? Well, it allowed this pawn to capture towards the center, kind of back up this pawn, but more importantly, this pawn could push forward. If it's captured, then the queen could capture. Now you have a queen over here. The king could move, maybe bring the rook over on this open file here, lining up on the king. So how to become good at chess, another way is look for angles of attack against your opponent's king. Ways to open lines up, like now this H file is half open here, lined up on the opponent's king. Now the rook lines up here, fighting for control of this open C file. Capablanca moves his king forward. Another way to get better at chess and become good is use your king when you can, as long as it's not going to come under attack, especially if the queens are still on the board. But especially later in the game, the king can become a very important piece. So what does this do? It allows the rook and the queen possibly to jump over here and start lining up on the half-open H file and maybe cause problems in the future. So Now we have the knight moving to the edge of the board. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, that rook to b8 would have been better apparently. But we have a knight on the edge of the board. So what does Capablanca do? He makes a mistake here, moving his queen over. All right. And now the game has swung in black's favor. Apparently g4 would have been a better move, to just push this doubled pawn forward and threaten an attack on this f pawn. Now this move, with the queen here, allows, let's see, bishop to take on a3, which that's hard to see. That would keep the game about even, and it's the best move. If you capture there, we might as well take a look at that, because, I don't know, it looks interesting. Bishop captures, then b takes a3, okay, because you want to go ahead in material. But now, knight to b3 is possible. All right. Rook up to c2, okay. Knight to a1. Oh, maybe you just chase the rook back and forth. Okay, you could go for a draw by repetition here, by just moving back and forth. All right, well, queen to f3 is played, and now we have knight to c4. So the knight jumps forward. How does Capablanca respond to that? This pawn is under attack. So he protects the pawn, and now the knight repositions back to d6, which is best, and from there the knight can jump forward to this outpost on e4. Now, another way to become good at chess is to use squares and outposts for your pieces. So if the knight jumps to e4, this is an outpost because no pawns can attack it there, only pieces. And if, let's say, the bishop captures, if the knight captures, then the rook will just capture this unprotected rook. But if the knight's captured, this pawn can recapture, and then just kind of, either pawn could capture and just really plug up the center here and congest white's position. All right, so in the game, we have the rook lining up here on the half-open file, aiming at the king. The knight does, in fact, jump into this outpost, but this is an inaccuracy here. So let's take a look at what would have been best. Bishop to f7 apparently would be better. Getting the the bishop off the back rank, protecting this pawn, and maybe allowing rook or queen to jump over here and try and target the king. So bishop captures is a great move apparently. So that was the best move in the position. Getting rid of that knight on the outpost. Now capturing towards the center is best. Now, if you have a flank pawn and it can capture towards the center compared to another pawn capturing away from the center, or a central pawn capturing there, it's generally better to capture with a flank pawn towards the center, because now there's 3 central pawns versus only 2 center pawns by white. And like I said, the position is congested, but there aren't many pieces on the board for black to be able to take advantage of that. So one way, one strategy that you can learn about is if you're able to cramp your opponent's position, that's good if they have a lot of pieces. And so if your position is cramped, you want to trade off some pieces to give your remaining pieces some more breathing room. And on the other end of that, if your opponent is pushing all his pawns forward, creating a lot of space, and you trade off pieces, they might have weaknesses from all those pawns they pushed forward and not enough pieces to fill in all the gaps they create as they push pawns forward. All right, so queen up here to g4, the best move. All right. Maybe the threat is to try and get up here and threaten a mate at some point if this knight gets out of the way. Let's see what happens. An attack on the queen. All right. The knight captures. A brilliant move by Capablanca, sacrificing his knight for 2 pawns, but now there is a threat of mate here. So what can be done? How do you take care of that? The pawn is pushed forward here, backed up by this bishop. But man, this king is looking kind of like it's hanging out in the wind here. So now the pawn is pinned. We add more pressure with our doubled pawn. So the rook comes down and gets ready to swing over to help defend, perhaps, maybe attack the queen. The pawn pushes forward to prevent that attack on the queen. But now Capablanca has a passed pawn. So another way to become good at chess is learn how to create passed pawns. There are actually 2 passed pawns here, and then you can try and promote them in the endgame. All right, so the king is trying to run for its life here. And now we have this mistake by Capablanca. So he goes after a pawn, but this could create counterplay against our own king. Let's see what happens. Best would have been to just push your passed pawn forward and gain space. It's interesting that that would be the best move, because it looks like the bishop could just capture and attack your queen. Then what do you do? Well, maybe you could just capture over here and be backed up by this. So they're saying best is, g4, excuse me. Best would be g4, bring the other pawn in. All right. Yeah, so just put more pressure on this pawn right here and try and undouble your own pawns. That would be a good move. But instead, Capablanca goes after this pawn, tries to activate his knight, and he's knocked out the defender of this e4 pawn. But the best move is played, lining up on the knight. So we have capture, queen captures, and now an attack on this pawn. So the pawn captures. This allows a check here. And it's looking pretty dangerous. Now the the king runs. The rook lines up here, attacking the other rook. And this is a mistake. So it looks like bishop to g8 attacking the queen is best here. Yeah, this is looking tricky here. Computer says the game is still close, but the best move is played, attacking the queen. We have a check. The king attacks our rook. Rooks are exchanged. But here's another thing to look at to become good at chess. Try to create more pawn islands than your opponent. Try to create more pawn islands with your opponent's position and have less pawn islands yourself. Why? Because now these pawns have no pawns beside them that can protect them. So the only thing that can protect all these isolated pawns are pieces. And so here, if we look at all of white's pawns, these pawns are all doing a good job of protecting each other. So now white has all these targets to knock out these pawns. And what does he do? He moves his king up, targeting this pawn. And we have a blunder here. A blunder by Lasker. This allows queen to capture with check here. Let's see what is played. And well, before I do that, what should have been played? Bishop to f7 would have been better. So it would have been better to play bishop to f7. That would still leave white with a slight edge, but the game would be a lot closer here. All right. So, and it activates this bishop a little bit better. You know, the queen could attack. Well, at the moment it can't because the queen is covering this. Oh, what am I thinking? That's our own pawn. Okay, let's move along here before I lose my train of thought. This is the best move. And then here, what would have been better? Just to capture this pawn. Go ahead in material here by capturing this pawn. Oh, now it doesn't like that. It's saying queen to a5 would have been better. Okay. Why? Well, the king could maybe capture this pawn whenever it wants. Queen to a5 would kind of target this pawn in case the queen moved, and the queen could drop back here and help protect these pawns from queen to a5 down to c3 here. All right, in the game, what did we have? We had queen to e6, a mistake. The king just moves up. We have a capture, an inaccuracy, and now, you know, of course, the king captures, and we have two passed pawns. So 6 pawns versus 3 pawns and a bishop. Material is even, but these passed pawns are going to be very dangerous. Bishop to d5, the best move, so the king can't capture another pawn. And b4 is played. So the game continues with the king dropping back in order to allow this pawn to push forward, and then both passed pawns can maybe start moving. So the bishop drops back, pawn is pushed forward, but now this is an inaccuracy. It would have been better, apparently, to bring the king forward. Maybe run your king up here at some point and go after these pawns. But the bishop drops back, the king attacks. So now it's not looking too good because it looks like this pawn could fall. So anyway, we're just kind of going into the end game, and this is why it's important to study end games. And it's probably getting dark in here. Turn on a light. Okay, so let's finish out the conclusion of this game. The pawn pushes forward, attacking. So after, instead of a capture, we have a capture over here. This allows a passed pawn to start moving. So this pawn is forced to push forward, otherwise that pawn would just promote. So capture. Now this blocks the passed pawns, but it's not looking good because the king pushes forward, and the last 2 moves of the game were a5. This pawn is running, trying to promote, and that's the best move, but white is winning. f6 is played, although king to e7 is even better because that could immediately allow you to push this pawn. The bishop would have to be sacrificed, king could capture, and then this pawn could start pushing. So after this move, the game ended here. Lasker resigned and Capablanca won. But you know, how could it have continued? The computer recommends king to g6. All right. But now you can just push up this pawn. Now bishop to e8 to try and slow the pawns down. But that allows d7. Bishop could capture over here, but then the other pawn would promote. You know, either way, there's a mate in 4. So if we go back, you know, what else could have been tried here? You know, after this move, What if they tried to push this? Well, then you can just push that. Bishop captures, king captures, the pawn starts pushing, this pawn pushes. A2, C7, we have a queen, and the difference is a promotion with a check here, and it's a mate as well, because these pawns stop the king and trap it on the back rank. All right, anyway, how to become good at chess? Well, play regularly, study your tactics, do puzzles, regular tactical puzzles every day if you can. Go over videos, books for strategy, end games, play through games of the greatest players in the world, both past and present, and that'll help you. All right, well, feel free to leave any comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.